very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I will try and keep within the 10 minutes you've requested that we do, and I absolutely agree with that. The day of the State Opening of Parliament is actually quite surreal, because you have all the sort of pomp and the gold coaches and the ancient Rolls Royces and everything else out in the streets, and you then have a Prime Minister who comes into the chamber and tells us he's got all the big calls right on COVID and all the big calls right on finance, and then disappears. The reality of this country today is that we have 4.2 million children living in poverty in our society. 1.3 million babies, very, very small children, are being brought up in households in desperate poverty, often with not enough to eat, and a heavy reliance on food banks and food co-ops merely to survive. And so, dealing with poverty, dealing with those issues, does require wage rises, does require, as the member who spoke before me pointed out, an increase rapidly in universal credit. It does require recognising the desperate state of poverty within Britain, and it became very obvious during the COVID pandemic that there is a whole generation of people that came together in mutual aid groups that now recognise that poverty and food hunger is unacceptable in our society, and that the work that's been done on the right to food and so much else must be recognised and must be taken up. There is nothing in the speech that says anything that gives hope to those people living in desperate poverty at the present time. Many members have spoken about the problems of energy costs. There are 6.3 million people in this country living in fuel poverty, a very nice sort of sociological term, fuel poverty. What it really means is they can't afford to put the electricity on, they can't afford to buy the gas, they can't afford to heat their homes, and if they're lucky, they heat one room of that home, or they just go cold. I would have thought there must be quite a few members that were campaigning in the local elections last week who came across houses, even when it was getting dark, where there were no lights on. There was a reason. They could not afford to charge the key meter. They could not afford to put the lights on in their homes. That is the reality of poverty in this country. That poverty, again, leads to not just unpleasant living, it leads to hypothermia and a real serious problem for people just trying to survive. So why hasn't the government done what the French government did and introduced an energy price cap? Why hasn't it instead taken the hit on the increase in energy prices as a public good in order to protect people against it? Why isn't it promoting public ownership of energy rather than the massive profits being made by the energy companies at the present time during this period of crisis? And so I do think we have to look at all of those issues. 83% of adults say they're having noticing or suffering from a considerable increase in the cost of living, and that means not just food poverty, it means shortage of being able to buy clothes and so much else as well. These issues have not been addressed in that speech. I was interested in the speech, the very thoughtful speech made by the member for Newark just now, because he did address many of the housing issues that we face in this country. The homeless people that were very obviously on the streets of this country when the COVID pandemic started were housed because there was government intervention, sufficient funding given to local authorities to ensure that they were housed, and indeed some local authorities leased hotels, some bought new places, and a very large number, I don't think all, but a very large number of street sleeping, rough sleeping homeless people were housed during the pandemic. If we can do it during a pandemic, we can do it at any time. We can carry on doing that. It is simply immoral that anyone should be forced to sleep on the streets of this country at any time. And it does mean, however, addressing the issues of housing costs and housing stress. I represent an inner city constituency which has a very large number of council properties, a considerable number of housing association places, a small and declining number of owner-occupiers, and a very fast-growing private rented sector. By and large, the council properties are well managed and well run and have reasonable levels of rent. And to live in a council property gives people a considerable sense of security. Housing associations, I don't think, are particularly well managed. I don't think, by and large, they're very good at doing repairs. I don't think they're very good often at management, and they're profoundly undemocratic in their behaviour and refusal often to listen to tenants or have any real bearing on what tenants actually want. And I do think in any housing legislation we need to hardwire into it a sense of democracy in the way in which housing associations manage their properties and are forced to listen to their tenants. But it's in the private rented sector that the worst problems occur. About 30 to 33% of my constituency live in the private rented sector. The rent levels are absolutely horrendous. They are more than 3 times the level of council rents, and the local housing allowance is insufficient to help people mostly moving into the private rented sector. So those on universal credit moving into the private rented sector because there's insufficiency of council housing have to supplement the rent themselves or move way away from their community, their schools, their families, their support networks and all the rest of it. We've got to understand that if we're going to have such a huge proportion of our population living in the private rented sector, they need certainty of an affordable rent, they need certainty of long-term tenancies, and they need certainty that they won't be peremptorily evicted from that property and that they will get their repairs done when they need them to be done. Many of our local authorities, my own included, are very innovative and very creative in building some degree of protection and regulation within their communities, but it's this house and this place that should build those protections and those regulations within the private rented sector. And so there is so much in the speech that is simply, well, there's a whole lot of things that ought to be in the speech that are not there. If the government's proposing deregulation of the economy at a very time when we need an investment in the economy, if they're not doing anything about job protection, about fire and rehire, about the insufficiency of wages for so many people, then the inequalities, the gaping chasm of inequality in Britain will get considerably worse. There is a regional inequality, there is national inequality, there is social inequality, there is class inequality, and it is getting considerably worse. And I think this Parliament has to address those issues. And as my friend, Member Hemsworth, was saying, social inequality is dealt with either by dealing with the inequality by raising wages, by raising public expenditure and all those issues, or you repress the protests and repress the anger and try and control people who want to demonstrate against it. And so a whole agenda of a law and order society rather than dealing with the social divisions in society is not a very appealing prospect going forward. The last point I want to make is this. The world is in an environmental crisis at the present time. COP25 said that, COP26 said that, albeit there was a lot of greenwash surrounding it, and there is a massive problem of environmental disaster around the corner. And the global refugee crisis of 70 million people around the world comes from wars, comes from human rights abuses, comes from oppressive societies, but it also comes from the environmental disaster that we're facing. We cannot just close our doors on refugees. I absolutely and totally condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I hold my heart out and hand out to the Ukrainian refugees that have come to this country, albeit with great difficulty, no thanks to the Home Office processes and procedures. But we should hold the same handout and same welcome to refugees from other conflicts and other wars in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, in Palestine, in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, and all those other places, and recognise that if we want good human rights for ourselves, and those human rights should apply to others. They also apply to human rights of people to express dissent around the world. The number of journalists, real journalists, very brave people, who've stood up against oligarchs and dictators and have paid the ultimate price of being murdered as a result of it. should be recognised and should be supported. And our Home Secretary should think very, very carefully of the responsibility on her shoulders about whether or not somebody who has bravely reported about human rights abuses and military activities around the world, Julian Assange, should be removed from this country or not. I think he's a whistleblower who should be protected and a journalist who should be protected, not removed. Last point I'd say is this. We should be building a world that's fit for the next generation. We're bringing up a generation in this country of children that are overstressed and overtested in school, that are streamed out of sight almost in secondary school, and victims of the competitive culture between secondary schools, and then charged in college and heavily indebted in university, and then because their wage levels and so on are so low, cannot afford any decent or permanent place to live. What is the message we're giving to the next generation? They won't have it as good as the current generation. They're going to have to pay the debts for the future. We should be investing, nurturing, cultivating, and including all of those young people. Joy in their creativity, their art, their music, their science, their learning. They are the future. And what are we doing? Consigning them to stress and, in many cases, so much poverty. We can do things very much differently and very much better than we are at the present day. And sadly, this speech we've given today offers no hope whatsoever for any of those issues that I've drawn attention to today.
Ben Bradley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.